it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to make little knitted candies on your Addi Knitting Machine. So let's get started. So today I'm doing this on the Addi Pro, just to make it easier to see because the smaller machine will fit into the view of the camera better. But you can do this on either Addi, and you can make these as small or as large as you like. So here is one of the little candies. This is a purple one, and basically all we're doing here on the Addi is making a flat panel, and what makes it into a candy shape is how we finish it. So I'm going to start by making a flat panel on my Addi, and I'm doing this starting with the first white needle. So for this project I'm going to use an E-wrap cast on, which creates a pretty straight, clean edge, and it has a little bit of give in it. And the most important thing about casting on with the Addi is that if you're doing a cast on that's supposed to be permanent, as opposed to just putting the yarn in front of and behind the needles to create a temporary cast on, when you're doing a permanent cast on the Addi, the most important thing is that it has to be able to be tightened when you go to finish your project, because on the Addi, with all of the needles stretching the fabric and holding it so that it's stretched, when you go to cast on, if your cast on cannot be tightened at the end, then it's going to end up with a ruffled edge, because the cast on edge is going to be very stretched out compared to the rest of the fabric. So to do an E-wrap cast on, all we're doing is making a loop. And to make this loop, you're going to take your two fingers, your thumb and your forefinger, and you're going to twist the yarn. I have the yarn running over the top of those two fingers, and you're going to twist it. And the direction you twist it is important, because I want the yarn that's going to be the working yarn to be underneath the other one. So I have the yarn running over the top of my thumb and forefinger, and I'm going to twist it to the left, so that my tail yarn is running behind and the working yarn is running in front. And then when I turn that face down to go over the needle as a loop, then the working yarn is going to be underneath the yarn from the tail. So that is going to be the first stitch. I'm going to bring that needle down so that it stays. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to put my two fingers under the yarn, twist them to the left so that it creates a loop where the working yarn is going underneath the yarn from the stitch before. Then I'm going to put that into the hook of the next needle and bring the needle down. So I'm making each loop go over the hook of the needle, and the most important thing is that the working yarn always goes underneath the yarn that's coming from the previous stitch. And you're basically just making loops around each needle, but it's a twisted loop, so then that way it stays, it's permanent, and it can be tightened at the end. So I'm going to cast on a total of 10 stitches. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you can see how quick and easy a cast on this is. And so I'm just going to make sure that my last needle with the cast on stitch drops. My working yarn goes behind this red tab, so that when I go to knit the other direction, then my yarn will not come undone. My last stitch will not come undone or be all wonky. So now I'm going to go ahead and start knitting the flat panel. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to work 15 rows back and forth as a flat panel with these 10 stitches. And as when you're working with an E-wrap cast on, as each stitch comes up, you may need to encourage it to pop down to the base of the needle. Even though it's not tight, it just needs a little bit of encouragement to get down to the bottom. So just always keep that in mind as you're knitting the first row with an E-wrap cast on. So there's row 1. I'm going to knit 14 more. All right, so there's my 15th row. Just ignore the row counter because it doesn't work very well. And that is going to be the end of our flat panel. So now what I'm going to do is take the yarn out of the yarn guide, sink the last white needle, and it is always important that no matter how many rows you do, if you want to make it longer or make it shorter or whatever, that you end with an odd numbered row. If you started on the left of the black needles as I did, then you're going to want to make sure that when you finish a row, the next row will be, so that when you go to bind off across the stitches, the right side of the work will be facing you. Because if you bind off with the wrong side facing you, when you're binding off with a crochet hook as we're going to do, it doesn't look quite as clean. So I'm going to cut my yarn, leaving a pretty decent length tail, at least 2 feet or so. And I'm going to bind off, or I should say pick up the stitches with a piece of waste yarn. Okay. So now if you just give this a little bit of a lengthwise stretch, then you can see the texture, the knitted fabric lines itself up, and it's not all, stretched the way it was on the Addi widthwise. So that relaxes the fabric and makes all the stitches line up the way they're supposed to be. So what I'm going to do next is bind off with a crochet hook. And if you don't know how to do this, then I do have a video on how to bind off with a crochet hook. But I have a crochet hook here. I'm going to insert my hook into the last loop on the waste yarn, the one that the working yarn tail is coming out of. I'm going to pull that working yarn through that loop as if I'm going to do a chain stitch. And then I'm going to insert my hook into the next loop on the waste yarn and pull the yarn on my hand, the working yarn, through both of those loops. So I'm just keep doing this across, insert into the next loop on the waste yarn, pull the working yarn through both loops. We're basically slip stitching into each stitch across. And if you want more detail on that, then you can go watch my how to bind off with a crochet hook video. Alright, so that's the end of the bind off. It's very quick and easy, and it leaves a nice clean straight edge. So now we're going to tighten up the cast on, and as you can see, the cast on, no matter what kind of cast on you do, that's a permanent cast on, is going to be all stretched and loose because of the knitted fabric being stretched across the Addi machine. So what you're going to do to tighten this up is, here is the starting tail of our yarn. You're going to go to the opposite edge, and you're going to find the first loop of fabric, the first loose loop of yarn that's coming off of the corner of this piece. Then you're going to find the one next to it, the next loose loop next to it, and pull on it to tighten up the first one. Then you're going to find the next loop and pull on it, and the next loop and pull on it. And each loop that you pull on helps tighten up the one before it. And you're going to accumulate a bunch of slack every time you go to pull another loop, because as you keep going, you're pulling more and more slack out of this edge. And there's still some give in it, there's still some stretch in it. I'm not pulling it tight where that it doesn't stretch anymore. So then I'm going to pull this next one, and when it looks like all you have left to do is pull on the tail, sometimes the tail doesn't want to be pulled. So what you're going to do is tug on the tail a little bit and find the strand of yarn that the tail is pulling. So this is the tail right here, and if I want to pull the tail out of the fabric, I would pull up. So I'm going to pull from the other direction, which pulls on that loop of extra yarn and tightens it up. And then I can go ahead and pull on the tail to tighten up the cast on. And this is what the finished E-wrap cast on looks like. It's a very clean, straight edge. So now to make the rest of our candy, make this into a candy shape, we're going to sew this together into a tube. And I'm going to do this using mattress stitch and the longer tail, whichever tail is longer once you've finished your panel, which for me is usually the bind off edge. I'm going to put it onto my yarn needle, and I'm going to mattress stitch these two edges together, trying to take as little of a seam allowance as possible. So I'm only going into half of a stitch on each side. I'm not leaving an entire stitch column across the edge. And I'm just going to mattress stitch this edge together all the way across to make a little tube. Alright, so here is the end of my seam. This panel has completely been mattress stitched into a tube, and I'm going to take a little knot at the end of my seam here. And I'm going to leave that yarn attached to the yarn needle. Alright, so now what we're going to do is make the actual candy part, the inside of the candy. Now if we were to just stuff this with fiber fill, then being only one layer of knitting, the fiber fill would be seen through the fabric, and it would also try to work its way out. So instead of using fiber fill, we're just going to fill our little candy wrapper with a small ball of yarn. And this way, the color of the yarn, as long as you use the same color yarn to fill it, is going to automatically match, and it won't show through as another color or as the fiber fill would. So I'm going to make my little ball of yarn on my 2 fingers, and I like to just wind it around my 2 fingers a few times. We don't want this to be too big. Then turn it and then wind around that part a few times, and keep just turning it and winding just like you would wind a regular ball of yarn. We're just doing a tiny one, and you want to try to keep it tight and smooth and round, because the actual shape of the candy inside your knitted candy wrapper is going to depend on the shape of your little ball of yarn that you're winding. So when I've got about the size and shape that I want, I'm going to turn it, wind around a couple extra times, cut the extra yarn, and I like to take the crochet hook, pick up a couple strands of yarn out of the ball, like so, pull that yarn tail through to create a loop, tighten it, and then pull the tail through there to make a knot. So there's my little ball of yarn. That's going to be the actual candy. And what I'm going to do here is figure out which end of the candy wrapper is stretchier, and I'm just going to cram the little ball inside the tube till it's centered. And then all we're going to do now is cinch the 2 ends of the tube closed, like we have right here. So I'm going to take the yarn that's on my needle, and as you can see right here, this is the seam allowance. This bulky part right here is the seam allowance from where we made our mattress stitch seam. I'm just going to weave the tail of my yarn that's on the needle through that seam a little ways, about 3/4 of an inch, until I get to a good spot to cinch it, which is right where you can pinch both thicknesses of the knitting, and you can, you're not just pinching the ball, you're actually pinching the 2 pieces of knitting together until they're totally flat. So that's where I want to come out, and I'm going to make another knot right here, and then I'm just going to wind the yarn on my needle around the knitting a few times and find a good spot to pick up a strand of yarn or a strand and a half off of that place where you just wound it, tie a knot, and then we're going to work our yarn across to the other side. And I like to do this by going through the center of the ball of yarn. I feel that that's more secure. Come out on the other side in the same place where I'm going to cinch the other side. I'm going to tie another knot, because when you pull on it, you don't want it to pull from the other side. So we tie a knot there to secure it and anchor it so that when you go to pull and wrap, it doesn't start pulling the other end. And then you're just going to wind the yarn around there a few times till you're almost out of tail, or just however many times you prefer. So I'm going to wrap the yarn around my needle to make a knot, Put it back in the needle because it fell out. Tie the knot right there. And I'm going to bury the tail inside the ball of yarn, like so. So there's your little candy, and all you have to do now is get rid of this tail. So what I like to do is put it onto my yarn needle and feed it, or I should say weave it into the mattress stitch seam allowance like I did with the first tail to work my way down to where I needed to cinch it, and then just shove it through the center of the ball of yarn. And make sure that it's not pulling on your seam. You want to stretch it out to make it flat and smooth, and then you can just cut your extra yarn. So there's your finished little knitted candy. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you think these little candies are cute, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you make them, tell me how they turn out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.